Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep on depression. And, it's a topic I know you're really interested in getting a better grasp on. We've got a really fascinating collection of sources here, clinical manuals, personal stories, the whole gamut to try and really unpack what depression is, why it happens, and most importantly, what you can actually do about it. And to help us sort through all this information, we've got our expert with us, someone who can make sense of even the most complex stuff.
It's great to be here. Yeah, depression, it's something that touches so many lives, and the more we understand about it, the better equipped we are to, help ourselves and others.
Absolutely. One thing that really struck me prepping for this deep dive is that depression, it's not just feeling sad, right? It's not just a bad day. It's something way more profound and way more complex.
Yeah, for sure. One of the sources we have, Andrew Solomon, he describes depression as grief out of proportion to circumstance. And I think that really captures how intense and persistent this condition can be. It's not just a feeling, it's a clinical condition. It affects your mood, your thoughts, your behavior, even your physical health.
It's not just a fleeting feeling. It can really grab hold.
Hmm.
Now, let's talk about the causes. I was thinking about it earlier, and it's almost like a detective case. You're trying to track down the culprit behind this really complex condition.
It's just a really good analogy. There's rarely one single cause. It's more like a web of different interacting factors. And our sources break these causes down into three main categories: biological, psychological, and social and environmental.
Okay, so let's break those down. What's going on biologically in someone with depression?
Well, you can think of your brain as this complex communication network, with chemicals like serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine acting as the messengers. And when these neurochemicals are out of whack, it can really impact mood regulation, sleep, energy levels, even your ability to experience pleasure. So it's not just about feeling sad, it's really about those fundamental changes in how your brain is actually functioning.
So it's not just about willpower or snapping out of it.
Hmm.
There's a real physiological basis for what's happening. And I know genetics play a role too, right?
Yeah, definitely. Family history can really increase your susceptibility to depression. It suggests certain genes might make some individuals more vulnerable to developing the condition.
So we've got this biological piece of the puzzle. What about the psychological factors?
That's where things get really fascinating. One of our sources, Aaron Beck, he's a pioneer in cognitive therapy, and his work highlights how these distorted thinking patterns, they can really fuel depression. For example, black and white thinking, where you see things only in extremes. Like if you fail at one thing, you assume you're a total failure. That's a common distortion. Imagine you're someone prone to this kind of thinking. You make a small mistake at work, and suddenly you're convinced you're going to get fired, you're incompetent, your whole career is over. That kind of catastrophic thinking can really spiral out of control. It contributes to these feelings of hopelessness and despair.
It's like these negative thoughts almost become self-fulfilling. You expect the
Okay.
worst. You see everything through that negative lens.
Mm.
And that just reinforces the negative beliefs.
Exactly. And on top of those negative thought patterns, low self-esteem and past trauma can also increase the risk of developing depression.
Makes sense if you're constantly putting yourself down or if you've experienced significant trauma.
Mm.
It's going to impact your emotional well-being. It's going to make you more vulnerable. Speaking of trauma, one of the sources that really stood out to me was Bessel van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score.
Oh, yeah, that's a powerful one. What was it about that book that struck you?
I think van der Kolk really emphasizes how trauma, especially in childhood, it can leave a lasting imprint on both our minds and bodies. It's not just about the memories, it's how those experiences can actually change our brain chemistry and nervous system,
Mm.
make us more susceptible to things like anxiety, depression, other mental health challenges. It's like our bodies are holding on to those experiences.
That's a key takeaway, and it's important to remember that trauma can take so many forms. It can be flashbacks or nightmares, but it can also be physical chronic pain, digestive issues, even a weakened immune system. It's not always obvious, which is why it's so important to explore the role of trauma.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about biological and psychological pieces of the puzzle. What about the social and environmental factors? How do those come into play?
Well, think about major life stressors, losing a loved one, divorce, financial struggles, chronic illness. These types of events, they trigger this cascade of emotional and physiological responses, and that can make someone more susceptible.
It's like your whole world is shaken up. Your sense of security, your sense of stability, it's all thrown off.
Exactly. But it's not just these big life events. Social isolation and loneliness are also huge factors. Think about Johann Hari's book, Lost Connections. He argues that the opposite of depression isn't happiness, it's connection. And when we feel disconnected from others, from meaningful activities, even from ourselves, it creates this breeding ground for depression.
That's so interesting. It's not just about being happy all the time. It's about feeling like you belong, like you have a purpose.
Right, and lifestyle factors play a role too. Things like chronic sleep deprivation, poor nutrition, lack of exercise, excessive substance use, they can all impact your mood. They make you more vulnerable.
So it really is this complex interplay of all these factors. Now that we have a better understanding of what depression is and what might be causing it, let's move on to how we can recognize it in ourselves and in others. What are some of the signs? What are some of the symptoms that someone might be struggling?
Understanding the symptoms is key. One of our sources is the DSM-5, which stands for the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's basically a guidebook that mental health professionals use to diagnose conditions, and it outlines specific criteria for diagnosing depression.
So it's like a roadmap for clinicians, helping them make accurate diagnoses. But I imagine it's pretty complex, pretty technical.
It can be, but the key takeaway for us is that it provides this comprehensive list of symptoms. And one of the most prominent is that loss of interest we were talking about.
Right, so it's not just feeling sad. It's losing that spark for things you used to love. I think we've all had those periods where we feel down or we lose interest in things for a bit.
Yeah.
When does it cross the line into something more serious?
That's a great question. It's important to remember that everyone experiences depression differently, but there are definitely some key things to look for. Instead of just feeling a little down, you might find yourself withdrawing from social activities, maybe neglecting your hobbies, having trouble concentrating at work or school. It's like those things that used to bring you joy, they just don't hold the same appeal.
Like a part of you is shutting down?
Yeah.
What about those physical symptoms? I know the DSM-5 mentions those too.
Oh, absolutely. Changes in sleep are really common. You might find yourself tossing and turning all night, unable to fall asleep. Or maybe you're sleeping way more than usual, but still feeling exhausted. And fatigue is a big one. Even after a full night's sleep, you just feel drained. No energy, no motivation.
I can see how those physical symptoms would really impact your daily life.
Exactly. And it's not just sleep and energy. Some people experience unexplained aches and pains, headaches, digestive issues, changes in appetite. It's like your whole body is out of sync.
So if you're experiencing a bunch of these symptoms, both the mental and physical, it's a sign to pay attention and maybe seek professional help.
Exactly. And a good guideline is the 2-week rule. If these feelings persist for more than 2 weeks and they're starting to disrupt your daily life, that's when it's time to reach out to a healthcare professional.
Okay, so now we're starting to get a clearer picture. What depression looks like, how it shows up, and I know what everyone's thinking. What can we actually do about it? What are the paths forward?
That's what we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive. The good news is there are multiple approaches, and it's not one size fits all. We'll explore those options, and we'll talk about how you can reclaim your well-being.
Okay, so we've really explored what depression is, all those intricate factors that feed into it. And now I think the part everyone's been waiting for. What can you actually do? What are the paths forward?
Well, the good news is there isn't just one right answer. It's not a magic bullet. It's more about finding that toolbox, strategies that work for you. And one of the most powerful tools in that toolbox is seeking professional help.
Therapy, right. A few of our sources really talk about that.
Exactly. Therapy can be so helpful, and there are many different types. But one that often comes up for depression is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
Okay, I've heard of CBT, but to be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on what it actually is. How does it work?
It's all about changing those negative thought patterns we were talking about earlier. Remember Aaron Beck and his work on cognitive distortions? Well, CBT is like you're taking those distorted thoughts, putting them on trial, and then replacing them with more balanced and realistic ones.
So instead of thinking I'm a complete failure because I messed up that presentation,
Yeah.
you might try, okay, I made a mistake, but it doesn't mean I'm a failure. Everyone makes mistakes. I can learn from this.
Exactly. It's about recognizing those automatic negative thoughts and then developing those skills to interrupt them, challenge them, and replace them with more helpful thoughts.
That sounds really empowering, like you're taking control back.
Exactly. It's about building that mental resilience. And, in some cases, medication might also be part of the treatment plan. I know that can be a little bit of a tricky topic. What are your thoughts on antidepressants? I know some people can be hesitant about them.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can see both sides, to be honest. I think there's a stigma sometimes around taking medication for mental health conditions, like it's a sign of weakness or something. But on the other hand, if antidepressants can help someone function better, feel better, I don't see why it should be any different than taking medication for any other health condition.
I think that's a really thoughtful perspective. And one of our sources, a psychiatrist actually, they made the point that antidepressants can be especially helpful for people with severe depression or when other treatment options haven't worked. But they were very clear. Medication should always be used under the guidance of a qualified doctor.
Right, it's not a do-it-yourself thing.
Mhm.
Okay, so we've got therapy, medication. What about building that supportive circle? A few of our sources mention that.
Yeah, and this is where Johann Hari's work on connection comes in. Remember, he argues that the opposite of depression isn't happiness, it's connection. So building a network of people you can rely on, people who get it, who understand, can be a huge part of healing.
That makes sense. You don't have to go through this alone. But what if you're someone who doesn't have a big family, a lot of close friends? How do you even start building that support?
That's a really valid concern. And it's important to remember that support network, it doesn't have to be huge. It can be just a few trusted people, a friend, a therapist, a support group. There are also online support groups and communities. Those can be helpful if you're feeling isolated.
I love that idea, like finding your tribe, even if it's online.
Mm.
And speaking of finding things that help, some of our sources talk about lifestyle changes. What are some things people can do day to day to support their mental health?
This is where it gets really practical. Honestly, sometimes it's the small, everyday things that can make a big difference. One practice that several of our sources mentioned is mindfulness meditation.
Mindfulness meditation, it seems like it's everywhere these days.
Yeah.
But I'll be honest, I've always been a bit skeptical. How can just sitting there, paying attention to your breath, how can that really help with something as serious as depression?
I understand the skepticism. And it's not a quick fix. But think of it this way. When you're depressed, your mind is often racing with negative thoughts, worries, self-criticism. Mindfulness, it's about training your mind to focus on the present moment without judgment. It's about noticing those thoughts and feelings without getting swept away.
So it's like you're creating some space between you and those negative thoughts. Like you're not trying to make them disappear, but you're not letting them control you either.
Exactly. And the more you practice mindfulness, the better you get at observing those thoughts and emotions without getting hooked. And that can be so freeing because it gives you the power to choose how you respond instead of just reacting.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. It's like building a muscle, but for your mind. Speaking of building that mental strength, I remember one of our sources, Tar Brock, talked about radical acceptance. What does that mean, especially when we're talking about depression?
Radical acceptance is about acknowledging what you're feeling, the sadness, the hopelessness, whatever it may be, without trying to push it away or judge yourself for it. It's about being kind to yourself in the midst of your struggle.
Like giving yourself permission to feel what you're feeling, but not letting those feelings define you.
Exactly. And it's not about resigning yourself to feeling bad forever. It's more about recognizing, hey, I'm in a tough spot right now, and that's okay. Fighting those feelings, it often just makes them stronger. But when you can accept them, you create space for healing to begin.
That's such a powerful shift in perspective. And it reminds me of that idea from CBT about challenging those distorted thoughts.
Yes, CBT gives you some great techniques for doing that. Remember those automatic negative thoughts. Well, instead of just accepting them as truth, you can start to question their validity.
It's like you're putting those thoughts on trial. You're the
Mhm.
defense attorney, and you're looking for evidence.
Love that analogy. And often when you really examine those thoughts, you realize they're based on assumptions or distorted perceptions.
Mm.
Maybe you're catastrophizing. Maybe you're only focusing on the negative and ignoring all the positive. CBT, it helps you identify those patterns and then develop strategies to challenge and reframe them.
This is so helpful. It's like you're giving people actual tools to start changing those patterns.
Yeah.
And I can't forget stress management. I know it's huge for so many people, and it's something that comes up in a lot of the sources we looked at.
Absolutely. Stress and depression often go hand in hand. When you're chronically stressed, your body's in that constant fight or flight mode. It depletes your energy, it messes with your sleep, and it makes it so much harder to cope with those difficult emotions.
So what are some good stress-busting strategies? What can
Yeah.
people actually do to manage that?
Oh, there are tons of options. And honestly, the most important thing is finding what works for you. But here are a few ideas that came up in our research. Setting boundaries in your work and personal life, that's huge. Learning to say no to protect your mental health. And there are plenty of relaxation techniques, deep breathing exercises, yoga, journaling, spending time in nature, even just taking a few minutes to sit and enjoy a cup of tea. All these little things can add up.
It's like giving yourself permission to pause,
Yeah,
to recharge. And I think that's a key takeaway here. It's not about this one big solution. It's about building that toolkit. strategies you can use in different situations.
Exactly. It's about experimenting, figuring out what works best for you, what resonates, what feels doable, what fits into your life.
Okay, so we've covered a lot: therapy, medication, building that support network, lifestyle changes, mindfulness, challenging negative thoughts, and stress management. I feel like we've given our listener a lot to think about and some real concrete steps to take.
I hope so. And in the next part, we'll wrap up by really emphasizing self-compassion, and we'll highlight some additional resources you can check out to keep learning and growing.
We've covered so much in this deep dive into depression, everything from what it is, what causes it, to exploring those paths toward healing and well-being. As we wrap up, I want to circle back to something that really resonated with me throughout our conversation, that idea of self-compassion.
Oh, absolutely. Self-compassion is so crucial when you're dealing with depression. It's so easy to fall into that trap of self-criticism and blame. But those negative thoughts, they just add to the weight you're already carrying.
It's like you're fighting two battles, one against the depression itself and the other against your own inner critic. And that inner critic, it can be brutal.
It can be really harsh, but remember, you don't have to believe everything you think. Those negative thoughts aren't facts, they're just thoughts. And thoughts can be changed. This is where those CBT techniques we talked about can be so helpful.
Right? Like challenging those thoughts, reframing them in a more balanced and compassionate way. So instead of, I'm such a failure, I can't even get out of bed, you might try, okay, it's tough right now, it's a hard day, but I'm doing my best.
Exactly. It's about offering yourself that same kindness and understanding you'd give to a friend going through something tough. And, one thing that really struck me going through all these sources is that recovery is possible. It might not always be a straight line. There might be ups and downs, but healing is possible.
That message of hope, it's so powerful. And it's something that shines through in a lot of those personal stories we've looked at.
Yeah.
People who've been in the depths of despair, they found their way back to a place of peace and joy.
It is incredibly inspiring and reminds us that even in those really dark times, there's a flicker of light, a chance for change. Speaking of finding your way, I wanted to mention some additional resources. We've talked about therapy, medication, but there's so much info online in books.
That's true, and it can feel overwhelming trying to figure all that out on your own. Where would you suggest people start?
Well, the National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH, they have a great website, really reliable, up-to-date info on depression, symptoms, treatment options, where to find help. The American Psychological Association, APA, also has a really good resource section on their site. And if you're more of a book person, I always recommend Feeling Good, The New Mood Therapy by David D. Burns. It's a classic guide to CBT, really clear and easy to understand.
Those are great recommendations. And I'd add that many communities have local mental health organizations and support groups. They can offer more guidance and support. Don't be afraid to reach out. There are people who care, who want to help.
You got it. You are not alone in this. And remember that powerful message from Johann Hari. The opposite of depression isn't happiness, it's connection. So nurture those connections. A friend, a therapist, a support group, even nature. Find what gives you that sense of belonging, that sense of purpose.
That's beautiful. Well, I think we've given you a lot to think about, a lot to explore. As we wrap up this deep dive, take a moment to reflect on what resonated most with you, what really stood out, what new questions do you have, and most importantly, what action will you take, even a small one, to care for your mental well-being? Remember, you deserve to feel better, and there is hope for healing and recovery. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
It's been a pleasure diving into with you. I